Chapter 7: The Ecology of Aggression. The walk back to the safe zone felt different. It wasn't just the satisfaction of silence, the slimes having been reduced to their constituent puddles, but the weight of the potential hanging over his head. Gideon trudged through the undergrowth, his boots squelching in the mud, but his mind was entirely occupied by the glowing blue prompt hovering in his peripheral vision. Level 5 reached. Unallocated stat points, 30. 30, Gideon whispered, testing the number. It felt substantial. It felt like a budget surplus at the end of a fiscal year. He had disciplined himself to hoard the points from levels 3 and 4, adhering to a strict wait-and-see policy. It was a basic scientific principle. Don't commit resources until you understand the variables of the environment. Well, the environment had spoken. The variables were, things were heavy, the ground was uneven, and running out of mana meant getting tackled by acidic jello. He pulled up his status sheet, the blue light casting a ghostly pallor on the darkening trees. Okay, he muttered, leaning against a mossy rock to catch his breath. Let's optimize the chassis. He looked at intelligence first. His mana pool was currently 400. It was enough for 4 shields, maybe 5 if he pushed it. But in a sustained engagement, or against something that didn't just bounce off, he would need deep reserves. Mana is everything, Gideon reasoned. If I run out, I'm just a guy in a burlap sack with a bent stick. If I have MP, I am a physicist with a force field. He dumped 10 points into intelligence. Intelligence, 40 to 50, MP 500. A shiver ran up his spine, not from cold, but from a sudden electric clarity. It felt like drinking a triple espresso after a good night's sleep. The geometry of the forest leaves seemed sharper, the calculations of their sway in the wind arriving in his mind before he even consciously asked for them. Better, he breathed. More RAM. Next, he looked at strength and agility. He remembered the humiliation of tripping over the root and the sheer, clumsy effort of swinging the iron sword.
I am currently driving a sports car with the handling of a shopping cart, he critiqued. I need traction, and I need to lift this sword without throwing out my back. He allocated 5 points to strength and 5 points to agility. Strength, 30 to 35. Agility, 25 to 30. The change was subtle, but immediate. The heavy iron blade tucked into his belt felt lighter, its mass less of a burden on his hip. When he pushed off the rock, his footing felt secure, his center of gravity adjusting automatically to the uneven terrain. 10 points left, Gideon mused. He looked at constitution and endurance. He was about to sleep in the woods. He had no tent, no fire, and a tunic made of scratchy vegetable fiber. Survivability, he decided. If I can't be comfortable, I should at least be durable. He split the final 10 points evenly. Constitution, 30 to 35. HP, 350. Endurance, 30 to 35. Stamina, 350. A warmth spread through his chest, a deep knitting sensation that made the bruises on his ribs from the slime impact fade into a dull, distant ache. He felt denser, not heavier, but more substantial, like he had been upgraded from drywall to brick. Optimization complete, Gideon declared, closing the menu with a satisfied swipe of his hand. He pushed off the tree and resumed his trek toward the camp. He moved faster now, his legs eating up the distance with a newfound efficiency. He wasn't an athlete, he would never be an athlete, but he was no longer a liability to his own survival. He was a level 5 anomaly, and he had the math to prove it. He broke through the tree line and spotted the massive oak where Elara was waiting. She hadn't moved. She was still slumped against the base of the tree, wrapped in the cloak of the umbra, looking like a shadow that had decided to take a nap. Gideon approached quietly, or as quietly as a man in heavy boots could, and cleared his throat. I have returned, he announced, trying to strike a heroic pose despite the burlap. The local slime population has been culled. I have acquired data, experience, and a significant amount of sticky blue residue on my boots.
Elara cracked one eye open. The violet iris glowed faintly in the gloom. You're louder when you're confident, she observed, her voice rasping with exhaustion. Did you die?
I did not, Gideon said. I leveled. I am now a level 5 entity. Fear my incremental progress.
Elara snorted, shifting slightly to ease the pressure on her broken ribs. Level 5. Don't let the power go to your head. You're still wearing a potato sack.
It's a tunic, Gideon corrected, sitting down on a mossy root opposite her. And it breathes. Terribly. He looked up at the sky. The twilight was deepening, the horizon fading into a heavy, oppressive black. The air was growing cold, damp, and smelled sharply of sulfur. The sky looks like a 90% chance of misery, Gideon muttered, hugging his knees. As if on cue, a single drop of liquid fell from the canopy and hit his nose. Sizzle. Ow! Gideon rubbed the spot. It stung. Hypothesis confirmed, he sighed, looking at Alara as the first hiss of the acid rain began to echo through the leaves. Yep, the developers of this world really hate us. Night in the whispering woods didn't fall. It just strangled the light. Just a stark, terrifyingly rapid transition from twilight to a blackness so deep it felt heavy. The temperature plummeted with a speed that felt personal. Gideon sat on a mossy root, shivering in his burlap tunic. The fabric was coarse enough to exfoliate his skin with every breath, but it was the only thing between him and the damp, biting air. He pulled up his status sheet, the blue glow providing the only light in the immediate vicinity. Constitution, 35. Endurance, 30. He stared at the numbers he had just allocated. He felt the difference, a density in his muscles, a resilience in his chest that hadn't been there an hour ago. He was tougher. He could run longer. Fat lot of good that does me, he muttered, wrapping his arms around himself. I have the durability of a brick wall, but I'm freezing like a wet dog. High stats don't provide insulation.
Alara sat a few meters away, her back against the massive oak. She was wrapped in the cloak of the Umbra, blending so perfectly into the darkness that Gideon had to squint to verify she was still there. She looked comfortable, annoyingly so. A drop of liquid hit Gideon's nose. Sizzle. Ow! Gideon rubbed the spot. It stung like a wasp sting. Another drop hit his shoulder, burning through the thin weave of the burlap. Then another. The sound of the forest changed from a rustle to a hiss as the rain began to strip the wax off the leaves. Acid rain, Gideon whispered, looking up at the canopy. Industrial runoff from a higher-level zone, or just a local atmospheric charm? He didn't wait for an answer. He thrust his hand up. Radiant lattice shield. The hexagonal barrier snapped into existence above his head, casting a golden, warm light over the small clearing. The rain slammed against it, hissing and popping as the refractive surface rejected the chemical assault. For a moment, Gideon relaxed. He was dry. He was safe. Then he looked at his mana bar. MP 445, 500. MP 440, 500. The numbers were ticking down. Even with his boosted intelligence, the drain was constant. Okay, Gideon murmured, his eyes tracking the depletion. 450 in the tank. Drain is roughly 5 per second under this volume. That gives me 90 seconds. He looked at the dark woods. The rain was settling in for the night. 90 seconds of dryness, he said to the empty air, versus 8 hours of night. He looked over at Alara. The rain was hitting her cloak and sliding off harmlessly. She didn't even twitch. Gideon looked back at his bar. MP 420, 500. He gritted his teeth. He could keep the shield up, feel like a wizard for another minute, and then pass out from mana exhaustion in a puddle of acid. Or he could accept the reality of his situation. Conservation of energy, he said, the golden light of the shield reflecting in his eyes. The math doesn't work. He dropped his hand. The shield vanished. The rain hit him instantly, cold and stinging. It wasn't strong enough to melt skin. His constitution was too high for that, but it was enough to be miserable. The water soaked into the burlap instantly, making the rough fabric heavy and sodden. Gideon gasped at the shock of the cold, curling tighter into a ball in the root. He wasn't a hero like in a video game. He was just a level 5 nobody in a potato sack, realizing that the hardest monster in the woods wasn't a slime. It was the weather. Gideon stared at the burlap sack lying in the mud. 10 minutes ago, it had been a prison that smelled of mildewed root vegetables. Now, as the acid rain hissed against the ground around him, it looked like the most precious resource in the universe, a membrane. Okay, Gideon said, wiping a mixture of rain and slime residue from his forehead. Problem, exposure to corrosive elements. Solution, I need a roof. Assets, 1 large sack, 1 geometrically compromised sword, and a physicist's understanding of fluid dynamics. He looked over at Alara. She was motionless under the cloak of the Umbra, the magical fabric acting as a perfect hydrophobic shield. She looked like a statue carved from darkness. Must be nice, he muttered, grabbing the sack, being a high-level assassin with legislative immunity to the weather.
He crawled toward the massive oak tree Alara was resting against. The root structure was immense, creating deep, mossy alcoves between the wooden tendons. It wasn't a cave, but it was a start, a natural structural support. He selected a hollow between two large roots that offered a natural windbreak. Phase 1, drainage, Gideon whispered. If I build a roof but sleep in a puddle, I have failed as a species. He drew the bent sword. The iron blade was heavy, rusted, and crooked. As a weapon, it was an embarrassment. As a gardening trowel, however, it was surprisingly ergonomic.
He gripped the hilt with his newly enhanced strength and drove the blade into the earth. The soil was compacted and laced with smaller roots, the kind of ground that would have blistered the hands of his old body in minutes. But Gideon Vance didn't feel the resistance. The blade sank in with a wet thunk. He twisted his wrist, using the bend in the metal as a scoop, and heaved a chunk of wet earth aside. He worked with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. He dug a shallow trench in a U-shape around his chosen sleeping spot, angling the channel downhill. "Gravity is free," he panted, tossing another clump of mud. "Water runs down. Basic hydraulics. Don't fight the flow. Direct it." Within 5 minutes, he had a functional gutter. The acid rain that washed down the side of the tree trunk hit his trench and was diverted away from his little patch of dryish earth. Phase 2, the frame. He sheathed the muddy sword, wiping it on the grass first because he had standards, and turned his attention to the undergrowth. He needed support beams. He found a cluster of saplings nearby. They were green, flexible, and about the thickness of his thumb. In his old life, Gideon would have needed a saw or a hatchet. Now, he simply grabbed a sapling near the base. He applied torque. Snap! The wood gave way instantly. He blinked, looking at the splintered end in his hand. His grip strength was absurd. He wasn't just breaking the wood, he was pulping the fibers. "Note to self," he murmured. "Calibrate manual input force. Do not shake hands with normal people." He gathered an armful of branches and returned to the oak. He stripped the leaves, saving the large ones, and jammed the ends of the sticks into the soft earth inside his trench. He bent them over, wedging the other ends into the crevices of the massive tree bark, creating a series of small, tension-held arches. "Triangles," Gideon lectured the empty air. "The strongest shape, or, in this case, a semi-conical lattice. It's not pretty, but it distributes the load." Now came the critical part, the burlap sack. He held it up. It was large, big enough to hold a crouching man. But it wasn't a tarp, it was a cylinder. "I have to ruin the integrity to maximize the surface area," he decided. He took the bent sword and found the seam of the sack. Using the edge, which was dull but sharp enough for fabric, he sawed through the stitching. The sack opened up into a long rectangular sheet of coarse, scratchy fabric. He draped it over his stick frame. It covered the top and the back perfectly, creating a taut, brown roof. He used heavy stones to anchor the corners, pulling the fabric tight so the water wouldn't pool and sag the roof onto his face. "It covers the torso and head," Gideon critiqued, stepping back to admire his work. "My legs are going to get wet, but the vital organs are shielded. Acceptable compromise." It wasn't finished, though. The wind was whipping rain in from the sides. Phase 3, shingling. He grabbed the pile of broad, waxy fern leaves he had stripped earlier and began to weave them into the gaps of the stick frame where the burlap didn't reach. He started from the bottom and worked his way up, overlapping each leaf over the one below it. "Shingles," he whispered, his fingers working quickly. "Water hits the top leaf, slides to the next, slides to the ground. If I do this right, the surface tension does the work for me." It was tedious work, and his hands were getting cold, numb, and covered in mud. But there was a strange satisfaction in it. This wasn't magic. He wasn't spending mana or waiting for a cooldown. He was building a machine, a very primitive, organic machine, to solve a problem. Finally, he stepped back. The shelter looked like a pile of yard waste that had been kicked into a tree. It was lopsided, the burlap was stained, and it smelled aggressively of old potatoes and wet dog. "It is," Gideon declared, wiping rain from his eyes, "an architectural triumph." He crawled inside. It was a tight squeeze. The roof was barely inches from his nose. The smell of the burlap was overwhelming, a musk of damp earth and rot that filled his lungs. But as he curled up, pulling his knees to his chest to fit entirely within the dry zone, the stinging hiss of the acid rain stopped.
He heard the rain drumming on the fabric inches above his head, steady, rhythmic impacts, but not a drop touched him. The water ran down the burlap, over the shingled leaves, into his trench, and away down the hill. He was dry. Gideon released a long breath, tension draining from his shoulders. He looked out through the small opening of his lean-to. AETHER sat just a few feet away, still wrapped in her cloak. From this angle, peering out of a pile of sticks and scavenged debris, the contrast between them was almost funny. She looked like a high fantasy assassin, a creature of magic and shadow. He looked like a badger hiding in a hole. "Hey," he said, his voice muted by the burlap overhead. AETHER didn't move, but her reply carried back to him, clear and amused. "Nice nest. Does it come with a guest room?" "It comes with structural integrity and drainage," Gideon answered, shifting to find a comfortable spot on the roots. "And it costs 0 mana. That's an infinite efficiency rating." He closed his eyes, listening to the rain hammer his little fortress. It wasn't the Helios Nexus, it wasn't a bed, but for tonight, it was a victory. "Phase 4, he said, as sleep began to pull at him. "Don't get eaten by anything that thinks I look like a burrito." Sleep didn't come easily. It hovered at the edge of Gideon's awareness, held back by the relentless rhythm of the acid rain striking the burlap inches from his face. The shelter was warm, warmer than the outside at least, trapping his body heat in the small pocket of air. The smell of wet earth and old potato sack was suffocating, but familiar. Then the smell shifted. It wasn't the sharp tang of acid rain, or the musk of burlap. It was the stench of stagnant river water and rotting fish. Gideon's eyes snapped open. In the pitch black of the lean-to, he couldn't see anything, but he could hear. The rain still pounded overhead, but beneath it came a wet, dragging movement. Something was pulling itself through the mud right outside his entrance. A rough scrape, a heavy squelch, a slow, searching inhale. Gideon held still, heart pounding against his ribs. He reached for the bent iron sword beside him, fingers closing around the cold hilt. A head pushed through the gap in the fern-shingled entrance. It was hideous. Even in the gloom, the faint glow of bioluminescent fungi on the forest floor cast enough pale green light to reveal the intruder. It looked like a catfish crossed with a bulldog, slick, rubbery skin, a wide, flat mouth full needle-like teeth, barbels twitching as they tasted the air. Mudmaw, level 4. The creature paused, its beady eyes locking onto Gideon. It released a harsh, steaming hiss. "Nope," Gideon said, pulling back. "Get out." The Mudmaw didn't care about boundaries. It lunged. Gideon panicked. He swung the heavy iron sword in a frantic, desperate arc. Clang. The shelter was too small. The blade smashed into one of the sapling support beams, shaking the entire roof and showering dirt into Gideon's eyes. The sword rebounded, jarring his wrist, completely useless in the cramped space. "Damn it," Gideon shouted, blinking through the gust. The Mudmaw seized the opening. It surged forward, jaws snapping shut on Gideon's left forearm. Pain flared, sharp and hot. Teeth punched through the burlap and into his skin. Gideon yelled, kicking out wildly, but his legs were tangled in the folds of the sack. HP 335, 350. He dropped the sword. He couldn't swing it. He just needed to get this thing off. He grabbed the creature. His right hand clamped around the Mudmaw's throat, or where a throat would be if it had one. His fingers sank into the slime-coated, rubbery flesh. Gideon squeezed. He squeezed with the desperate strength of someone fighting for his life. In his old world, this would have been hopeless. He would have been too weak, his grip slipping on the slime. But this was the new Gideon. Strength 35 Gideon. I felt the muscles in his hand tighten. Hard. Too hard. The Mudmaw's eyes bulged. Its jaw sprang open, releasing his arm as it thrashed, realizing too late that his prey had a grip like a hydraulic press. "Let go," Gideon growled. He didn't just push it away. He slammed it sideways, driving its skull into the thick root forming the wall of his shelter. Crack.
The sound was wet and sickeningly final. The Mudmaw went limp instantly, its thrashing replaced by a twitching silence. Gideon shoved the carcass out of the shelter, kicking it into the rain. He scrambled backward, pressing his back against the tree root, clutching his arm. He was panting, his chest heaving. His heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of his throat. "Okay," he wheezed. "Okay, that happened." He looked at his arm. The bite marks were deep, tearing through the skin. Blood, bright and red, and very real, welled up and began to drip onto his tunic. It didn't stop. It didn't magically knit together. It just hurt. His high constitution meant he could take the hit without going into shock, but it didn't turn him into a superhero. He was still bleeding. That is a lot of blood," Gideon stammered, his stomach turning slightly. A voice drifted from the darkness outside, calm and dry.
"You're loud when you kill things."
Gideon froze. He leaned forward to peer out of his hole. AETHER hadn't moved. She was still under the tree, dry and shadowy, but her eyes were open, watching him.
It tried to eat me, Gideon defended, his voice still shaky. I think I broke its neck. I just grabbed it and it crunched.
It's a scavenger, Alara said, closing her eyes again. They smell fear and food. Wrap that arm tightly or you'll bleed all over your new house. And if you bleed, more will come.
Gideon looked at his arm, then at the dead mudmaw in the rain. He felt a strange mixture of horror and awe. He was clumsy. He was untrained. He had panicked. But his hand, he remembered the feeling of the creature's skull giving way under his fingers. He wasn't a warrior, but he wasn't weak anymore. Right, Gideon muttered, tearing a strip off the bottom of his burlap tunic with shaking hands. Bandage, pressure, stop the leak. He bound the wound as tight as he could, wincing as he pulled the knot. The fabric turned dark with blood, but the flow slowed. He lay back down in the dark, listening to the rain, his hand still throbbing. He didn't sleep for a long time.